So this, and then the other 3 times that we'll be speaking. G'day. Well, today I wanted to speak with you a bit about what's real spirituality in comparison to pseudo-spirituality, what I'd call pseudo-spirituality. And what I find in our travels is that many people are very fascinated with investigation, right? Investigation of all sorts of things. So there are many people we meet who are scientific or have a science background in their nature or an engineering background in their nature, and are very fascinated about investigating scientific things, scientific matters, or engineering background, like turning science into practical applications. We also meet very many people who have come from religious backgrounds. So how many of you here have come from different religious backgrounds in your childhood? Yeah, quite a few of you. Right, so a few of the audience have. And is Sweden a very religious location generally? No. Not really? No worries. And how many of you have come from like a New Age sort of a background where you're interested in New Age spirituality? How many of you would classify it? So quite a lot of you. So you could say you come from that background. So when you come along to a talk that I give, obviously those particular backgrounds are going to influence how you interpret the information that I present. That makes sense, doesn't it? Now, what I'm going to suggest today is that there are basically only 3 important things to remember with regard to developing yourself in any way. 3 important things to remember. And I would call all of these important things to remember a part of your spiritual nature. And the reason why I feel there's only 3 things to remember is that every bit of development you can do inside of yourself in terms of how you interact with the world around you is dependent upon these 3 particular things, these 3 particular qualities, if you like, or desires that you may have. And what I find is that the majority of New Age and other spiritual paths finish up forgetting these 3 basic principles. So in other words, we get so involved in investigation, scientifically or metaphysically or in other ways, that we forget the 3 basic principles of what is going to make our life happy and enjoyable, but also what is going to be with us forever in our development. If we can remember these 3 basic things in every single thing we do, in every single application that we have a part of in our lives, then we will benefit immensely. So what are those 3 things? Well, let's look at the first one. Now, in the first century, I mentioned all of these 3 things, and I'll read you a few Bible verses for those of you who have a religious background, where I refer to these things in the first century too. But the first one is a quality that's inside of yourself, or can be inside of yourself, called humility. Now, I would define humility as a passionate desire to experience all of your own emotions and feelings, and to be open to everything that happens to you surrounding you, everything in the universe surrounding you happening to you, be open to that, even if those things are hard to deal with. In other words, that you take personal responsibility for absolutely everything that happens in your life, and you don't blame anybody else or try to be angry with anybody else or try to make anybody else responsible for those things happening in your life. You, within yourself, allow yourself to feel everything rather than blaming anyone else for what you're feeling. That's what I'd classify as humility. It also has this flavour, if you like, where you are open to receiving new information. Does that make sense? You're open to receiving new information. If we can turn off all mobile phones, thanks. Where you're open to receiving all new information, and you are free to receive all of that information inside of yourself. You don't have a blockage to doing so. So if you can think of you as an individual, so let's draw you just as a circle if you like. I might just get my markers because they're a bit thicker. Let's call that your soul, which we can define a bit later if you wish to. This soul of yours is completely open to experiencing everything, rather than trying to prevent the experience of everything. You see, in our day-to-day life, the majority of times, we are quite closed to experiencing everything. So, for example, we walk out the door here, and there's a cutting wind flowing through. And what do? We don't experience it. What do we do instead? We cover up, another layer on, until we don't have to experience that experience. Now that's a physical thing. Let's talk about more to do with emotional things. So if you're interacting at work with another person and the person starts to get angry with you, now most of us will do one of two things in that situation. We will either want to leave the person because we don't want to experience their anger, or we'll stay there and get angry back, generally. And we get annoyed back. And that's another way of defending the rage coming at us. But we don't want to just stay there and absorb it, to actually feel the attack. We don't want to feel the experience that's happening to us generally. We generally want to get away from it. Now, humility allows us to experience every experience that happens to us and to be open even to new experiences. To be open to hearing new things that before we would never have imagined we'd listen to. Recently I met a person from Canada and we met her in the presentation in England, and she said 3 months ago if you told her that she would be listening to a guy who calls himself Jesus and talking about God, she would have told you that you'd be totally crazy. Because she never had a concept of God. She never believed in any religious thing at all in her entire life. And up until 3 months ago, she was only involved in her general day-to-day life. They have a very big business, worldwide business, and they're just doing things to do with the business. And something came along in her life that caused her to listen, and she was open to doing so. That's humility, being open to hearing new things. Now, up until then, she'd lived a life as a lawyer, and 23 years in a firm. And during that time, if anybody had told her that down the track she would actually listen to somebody talking about God, she would have told them that they'd be very stupid to actually conceive such a thing. Her family life was that she never was presented about God except as a child, and then after that all of her family left religion, and she would never have considered listening about God in her entire life, she thought. Now that's not humility. That is being closed and guarded, trying to prevent things from coming to you. So this aspect of humility is very, very important. In the first century, I said that most people have blocked their ears and closed their eyes to receiving anything new. And isn't that the truth? We go around our day-to-day life a lot of the times and we have no concept of even what's happening to our next door neighbour, let alone the city we're living in or the country we're living in. We become blind to certain things. And it's generally only things that are fear-based that enter our life. You know, anything to be afraid of, that enters our life. Anything that's to do with new investigation, it's very hard for it to enter our life because many times we are already blocked to receiving it before we even begin. That has to change. If we are going to grow forever, if we are going to always continue growing in our soul, we need to allow ourselves to be humble to new things. We need to allow ourselves to be able to conceive that many of the beliefs that we have are very, very different to the truth. And being humble allows us to see that. Now, is there any questions about humility before I go on with the next essential thing? No? everyone's fine with humility. You're all very humble. Try to. An interesting thing about humility is that we often think we're being humble, but years later we realise that we weren't in that particular thing, whatever it was that we were looking at. And sometimes, I don't know about you in your life, but sometimes things get presented to us many times before we're humble. Have you noticed that? Like the same thing comes up again, the same thing comes up again, the same thing comes up. If the same thing is happening over and over again in our life, then it's a very good indication we're not humble enough yet. Because when you're humble, things change, things start changing. Right? And true humility allows for change. But if the same thing is happening, so for example, in our lives, for some of us, it might be we were married when we were young, and then we got divorced in our late 20s, and then we married another person, and wow, they almost seem like they were the first person in a different body. Right? So that's an indication that we're not humble. Does that make sense? That we haven't learned something that we need to learn. So that's humility. Humility. Quality of humility is essential. The next quality that's very important that we need to learn to have a love of is truth.